This is an RNZ podcast.
Just a quick warning. This podcast contains language and descriptions of violence some listeners might find confronting. It's early morning on Sunday the 6th of January 1985 inside one of New Zealand's oldest jails. Officially known as Mount Eden Prison, to its 375 inmates, it was simply known as The Rock. Not very original.
Welcome to Alcatraz.
You might know that's what they called the maximum security jail built on a large rock in San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz, one of the most famous lockups in the world. Mount Eden's not on an island. In fact, it's right beside a motorway flyover in central Auckland. But it was a forbidding place, built from rough-faced bluestone blocks and Gothic windows. Opened in the 19th century, so similar era to Alcatraz, it was more than 100 years old when Ross Appelgren was serving time. That day, did it just begin like any other?
It was just a Sunday. It was just a routine that happened on a Sunday.
That's the former Mount Eden guard we're calling James because he doesn't want his identity known. We heard from him in the first episode. James was one of the last people to see Anthony Darcy Te Hira alive. Te Hira went by several names. His wife Suzanne calls him Tony, but to guards and inmates at The Rock, he was Darcy. This is the first time James has publicly described his memories of that day.
And it was just like any other Sunday.
At around 6:35 a.m, Darcy was led out of his cell and met up with James for his first job of the day, delivering breakfast to the female prisoners. Within Mount Eden, Darcy was known as a trusted inmate, or trustee for short. He had one of the most sought-after jobs, working in the receiving office where new inmates were processed. And as a trustee, he was granted greater access to other parts of the prison.
I escorted Darcy over to the female division to deliver the breakfast. His demeanour when I took him over to the women's prison and when I brought him back a bit was the normal demeanour that I expected with Darcy. He was quite chatty, very cooperative. I mean, we were walking outside Mount Eden prison and across to the women's prison and he could have taken off. But there was never any question that he was going to do that.
And why would he risk it? In 3 days, Darcy was being released early, a reward for good behaviour. Another former guard, who also doesn't want to be identified, had spoken with Darcy the night before. His words are voiced by an actor.
Darcy was a nice guy. Someone I didn't think had any enemies. I remember during our last conversation, he discussed his family with me and told me he was really looking forward to being released.
By the time he took the meal in, handed all the trays and everything over to the female division staff and then picked up the old stuff and we wandered back again, 15 or 20 minutes. It was a Sunday morning, weren't in any hurry.
No hurry and no hint that Darcy was only minutes away from the vicious attack that would end his life. You're listening to Nark, an RNZ investigative podcast. I'm your host, Mike Wesley-Smith. This is episode 2, A Kitchen Murder.
I was aware Te Hira was in for a bashing because the word was that he had done a rip-off and was going to get a bashing, but nothing more than that.
I found Darcy Te Hira lying on the ground with what I immediately assumed to be a very serious injury.
Like when you saw the broken paddle, you see the guy on the ground.
I thought he'd been whacked on the head, obviously.
I'm going to take you step by step through the events of the morning that Darcy Te Hira was murdered. And you'll learn that his vicious bashing was initially passed off as something else. Perhaps mistakenly, perhaps not. This first telling will be based mainly on the accounts of witnesses without a criminal past, such as prison guards, police officers, and medical personnel. We'll get to what the other inmates saw and heard, or what they said they saw and heard, in a future episode. Mount Eden Prison had no security cameras in 1985, so police placed a lot of reliance on the witness account of a prison guard called Jim Stedman. Detectives described him as the only independent person in the kitchen area when the murder occurred. For that reason, you'll hear a lot of his account in this episode. First though, let's return to James, the guard who was with Darcy before he entered the kitchen.
If there was something major going to go down, you could feel it in the air. You knew something was going to happen. And there certainly wasn't anything like that on the Sunday.
He must have had any idea.
No, he appeared to be quite relaxed, and I escorted him back to the prison. I saw him down through the front basement into the kitchen.
The kitchen was renovated in 1994, so I couldn't see it for myself. However, I have seen video footage of how it looked in 1985. So, to paint a picture, the kitchen was part of a self-contained block. It had a bathroom with toilets and washing facilities, and a row of cells for the inmates that worked there. In the kitchen itself, the walls were lined with large cooking vats and ovens. There was a dishwashing area, and to one side of the kitchen was a small lunchroom, although people tended to refer to both areas as just the kitchen. Diagonally across from the lunchroom was Jim Steedman's office. That morning, the kitchen was a hive of activity, with 7 prisoners on shift working to get breakfast out to each of the wings. They were supervised by Jim Steedman, the acting kitchen instructor and a prison guard.
I've been a prison officer for almost 7 years, all of which I've worked at Mount Eden Prison.
Steedman died in 2018, so what you're hearing is his police statement made in the days after the murder, voiced by an actor.
The cell block holds 18 inmates. At about 5:10 a.m, the inmates started to drift through. Each of the prisoners knows his duties and he goes and does them. My office is in the kitchen from which I supervise the work. The office is situated to your right as you walk into the kitchen.
The kitchen was hot and noisy, a continuous din of steam pipes and large extractor fans working overtime, the clanking of pots and metal trays, and inmates chatting with one another. The perfect sound cover for a murder.
On Sunday the 6th of January, I remember Te Hira coming to the kitchen about 7:15 a.m. I remember him walking into the kitchen. He walked around talking to everybody. He came and spoke to me. He looked his normal self when he was speaking. He didn't look as though he was affected by anything in any way.
Of the 7 inmates working in the kitchen, 3 are important to our story right now. First, 33-year-old career burglar and prison cook Ross Appelgren. Ross is stationed at a metal vat, a big cylindrical boiler, stirring rice with a large wooden paddle. Ross has lived and worked in the kitchen block for around 5 weeks. Second is a white-collared crim, aged in his 20s, washing dishes at a nearby sink. We'll call him Ernie because his real name is suppressed. Ernie was doing time for more than 200 fraud convictions. And finally, we have a 37-year-old we're naming Gordon. Again, his real name is suppressed by a court order. Gordon had been locked up for seriously assaulting a woman, the latest in what judges said was his considerable history of violent offending. Jim Steedman remembers Darcy walking into the kitchen.
He left me and went and helped himself to some porridge from one of the metal urns. There was no aggro with anyone.
Darcy then took his porridge into the lunchroom. Now, this room isn't large. It was about 12 square metres with concrete walls and floor. A large window covered by a metal grille dominated one side of the room. Sparsely furnished with just a table and chairs, there was only one way in or out, through a doorway off the kitchen.
About 5 minutes before Te Hira went into the lunchroom, I had been into the room because I had gone to the storeroom, which only had access from the lunchroom. When I came out of the lunchroom, there was no one else in it. I walked out of the lunchroom, turned to my left and saw Ernie washing the dishes. I walked back to my office.
Given Ross was later said to be the killer, police paid close attention to where Steedman said Ross was at different times that morning.
I went past Appelgren, who was boiling rice.
Steedman said he sat down in his office. From there, he could see most of the kitchen, but crucially, only the doorway to the lunchroom. He couldn't see far enough into it to see where Darcy was sitting.
It was after, when I sat down, that Te Hira went into the lunchroom with his porridge.
According to Steedman, it was now 7:25 a.m. Another inmate, we'll call Frank, stopped by the office to have a chat. Steedman said no more than 3 minutes later, this happened.
I was then approached by Ernie, who came to the office door and said that guy in the lunchroom looks like he's ill. You'd better have a look at him.
On this timeline, Darcy must have been attacked between 7:25 and 7:28am, though these times will move around a bit in other accounts. Stedman followed Ernie from his office to the lunchroom along with Frank. Stedman later told detectives he couldn't recall seeing Ross Appelgren at his post near the boiler as he walked into the lunchroom. Ross would explain he'd left the kitchen because he'd been tipped off beforehand.
I was aware Te Hira was in for a bashing because the word was that he had done a rip-off and was going to get a bashing, but nothing more than that.
So this is quite extraordinary. Not only what Ross Appelgren is saying, but how he's managing to speak. Because Ross died in 2013, and this voice you're listening to, that came into being in 2025.
I guess I was like most kids. I was a career criminal. People thought it was strange, but it wasn't.
This is Ross saying stuff he wrote but never voiced out loud. So when I started working on this podcast, I had a bit of a problem because Ross's unpublished memoir was a treasure trove of information. But it was words on a page. Not great for a podcast. Sure, we could have got another actor in, but as Ross's testimony is so crucial, I wondered if there was a way we could hear it from his own mouth. Something more authentic. So I decided to turn to artificial intelligence, or AI. Whatever you think of its costs and benefits, its risks and advantages, it created something remarkable here. With the blessing and consent of his family, I used Radio Pacific interviews Ross had done to teach AI his voice patterns and then applied that to his own words.
I was aware Te Hira was in for a bashing because the word was that he had done a rip-off and he was going to get a bashing, but nothing more than that.
It's fair to say, at the start, it was a bit hit and miss. That Kiwi accent took some finessing to nail. But in the end, it got there. A dead man's words just the way he'd say them. Or as good as. It may be if you're listening to this podcast in years to come, AI-generated voices are commonplace, or maybe they're frowned upon. But as of 2025, when this podcast is being released, it's something RNZ has never done before. We've debated it at length and talked it through a number of times with senior editors. Where we've landed is that this gives Ross a chance to speak for himself, to plead his innocence in the way he did when he was alive. We're not imagining or embellishing anything. His voice is only used for his words, and as I said, his family were keen we gave him that voice. In this podcast, I'm laying out all the facts as I've been able to gather them. You'll get to decide what you think happened and if you think that's fair. So let's pick up with Ross and his recollection of what was going on that Sunday morning in 1985.
I had a fair idea of who was in on it, but I wasn't 100% sure. There was about 3 or 4 who I thought were going to be in on it, with 1 or 2 giving him a bash, while 1 or 2 kept an eye out. When Te Hira came into the kitchen, I was thinking, I don't want to be near this, just in case. You never know what's going to happen. The screws might get a bit upset about it or something. I wasn't thinking it would go that far. I don't think anyone was. Anyway, I took off down the toilets, and when I came back, it was all over. But that's what I've always said. I never saw it done.
So that's important. Ross claimed he was in the toilets around 40 metres from the lunchroom when Darcy was assaulted. That would eventually be his defence to a murder charge. Back in the lunchroom, Ernie, Frank and Stedman went to check on Darcy.
Te Hira was sitting in the chair at the table, with his back to the door. He was lying back in the chair, his head was tilted back, and he appeared as if he was in convulsion. He was twitching and his jaw was moving. I called to Te Hira, shook him, and then realised that there was something wrong with him.
Stedman said he and Frank laid Darcy on the floor and onto his side. Frank tried to open Darcy's mouth to stop him from biting his own tongue. Meanwhile, Stedman returned to his office to phone the prison nurse. He noticed he still couldn't see Ross. Based on Stedman's account, it's now around 7:30am.
I'm pretty certain Appelgren was not there. I let the phone ring about twice, but there was no answer. I then left the kitchen. As I reached the top of the stairs, the nurse and the medical officer were just coming through from the south wing. I asked them to follow me down to the kitchen as Te Hira was ill.
That's another key point. When the alarm is initially raised, it's believed Darcy is ill, not that he'd been attacked. Now, we heard at the end of the last episode that Darcy's widow, Suzanne Young, has never understood how prison staff came to that conclusion.
Did he have a history of seizures?
No.
He'd never, no,
Never.
epilepsy, nothing like that?
Never.
No. Any other health effects?
No.
Right.
No. This is why I thought it was bizarre.
Was it just a mistake or some sort of cover-up? Well, let's first look at the incident reports that were filed by the staff that were there. In her report of the incident, the prison nurse said she was alerted by Stedman at about 7:35. The prison medical officer who was with her said Stedman told them Darcy had collapsed. He then led them both to the lunchroom. At this point, Stedman said he saw Ross Appelgren back at his boiler. The nurse rushed to Darcy's side. We've had an actor read her account.
On examination, Te Hira was comatose and appeared to have vomited on his legs. Officer Beeman was requested to obtain resuscitation equipment. Officer Stedman was notified by me that Te Hira would require hospitalisation.
Though not included in her original report, the nurse later testified about the injuries she saw on Darcy.
I was holding his head, and I didn't note at that time any secretions of any sort, i.e. blood coming from his head. The only blood I saw was what was coming from his mouth.
Another soon to arrive on the scene was prison guard James, who'd let Darcy into the kitchen block. He later prepared a report of his actions that day, which I managed to get a copy of. And it turns out he's got a pretty good memory, because it's consistent with what he told me 40 years later.
I heard that there'd been an incident in the kitchen.
James reported Stedman told him Darcy had apparently experienced some sort of fit, and he asked James to call the ambulance. After calling 111, James went into the kitchen area.
I went through to see if I could offer any assistance, and I found Darcy Te Hira lying on the ground.
James saw Darcy was bleeding from his mouth. He had bitten his tongue.
There didn't appear to be any marks or anything else on his body.
Several minutes later, James noticed Darcy's face had turned purple while the skin around his eyes went black.
His head was swollen and his eyes were grotesquely protruding from his face.
Doctors later discovered that both of Darcy's eye sockets had been fractured during the assault. Across town, James's call to emergency services had been assigned to an ambulance crew on standby.
Just another day on shift. I was on life support unit. All came in. Off we went.
Ambulance officer Robert Ogier and his colleague Bruce Orwin responded to the 111 call. This is the first time Robert has ever described what he did that day. Their ambulance sped to the prison, knowing time was of the essence.
The first hour is magical. First hour you've got an 80% chance of recovery. After an hour it drops down to 20. So the first hour is paramount in any trauma.
Robert told me that back then ambulance crews followed the 3 Ps.
Pick them up, put them in the back and piss off to hospital.
Can you recall what you were told was the reason you were going to the prison when you were first called?
Fitting.
You were told it was because somebody was fitting?
Perhaps an epileptic fit.
How long do you think it took you from the time you got the call to get to actually the prison?
Not long.
Not long. You were driving?
I would have been there within 6 minutes.
According to the nurse's report, the ambulance arrived around 7:45, so about 10 to 15 minutes after Darcy was found.
We were met by, obviously it must have been a guard. We unloaded the stretcher, put the gear on it, which would have been an oxygen bottle and perhaps a life pack. And we would have had our, what we call our buddies, which is the first aid stuff and all the rest of it. On the stretcher, we were led through, just pulling the stretcher, going through to where up there. Came into what was the kitchen, because there's these big pots of porridge, and as there, the patient was lying on the floor, and it appeared to be fitting a bit like you'd expect for an epileptic fit.
Did you observe any obvious injuries on the patient?
No, I didn't see anything. I didn't notice any blood. I was more probably concerned of getting it out, getting the stretcher ready.
Robert said there was one unusual thing about the scene that confronted him when he arrived. Something that stuck with him all these years.
There was a broken paddle. Well, I found out it was a paddle. It was a broken stick, but it looked like an oar, so it was a paddle. It was lying between the patient and the pot.
Was it something you instantly noticed?
Yeah, because you almost had to step over it.
So within a metre of the patient?
Metre and a half.
Right.
Yeah, and it was broken in half. Definitely broken in half.
These wooden paddles were no normal-sized kitchen utensils. I want you to picture a super-sized wooden spoon, solid and hefty, 75mm thick and around 1.4 metres long. They had to be big enough to stir a cauldron filled with enough porridge or rice for almost 400 inmates.
Was it like an oar?
Yeah, just like an oar.
Similar size?
Yeah.
I should mention at this point that before joining the ambulance service, Robert had been a police officer, so he had experience examining crime scenes.
When you saw the broken paddle, you see the guy on the ground.
I thought he'd been whacked on the head, obviously.
You think that was an obvious conclusion?
Well, I've sort of been around a bit. I've seen lots of sort of weapons and sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And the way they were just, what got me was nobody was moving. Everybody's just standing there in the background.
Robert said the atmosphere in the kitchen was eerily strange.
There was no moving. There was nobody yelling or, anything like that. It was really, get out of here.
Was there anyone expressing concern?
No. Absolutely couldn't care less.
Robert and his fellow ambulance officer Bruce acted quickly.
Bruce made the decision, okay, right, let's get him on the stretcher, get him on oxygen, get him on the stretcher, and we'll get off to hospital. Probably not much more than 10 minutes.
The ambulance raced away with Darcy on board just before 8 o'clock.
We've got the patient here. Our absolute priority, is to get him to hospital as fast as we can. We knew the injury was serious. Once he got off at the hospital and put another stretcher back in.
His job done, Robert never saw Darcy again.
We just grab another one and off we go. And that's it.
Like I said, this is the first time Robert's described all of this. And despite hours and hours of research, until I sat down with him, I'd never heard mention of the broken paddle being left on the floor. A paddle that instantly made Robert think he was looking at the aftermath of an assault. It's important to acknowledge Robert is recollecting what he saw 40 years ago. That's obviously a long time. And of course, memories can sometimes fade, be contaminated, and people can genuinely, but mistakenly, believe what they remembered is what actually happened. I'm not saying that's the case with Robert, or anyone else you'll hear interviewed in this podcast recalling things from decades ago. It's just an important thing for anyone to weigh in the mix when assessing what they hear. But for his part, Robert is certainly adamant about seeing that paddle.
Would you say you've got quite a good memory?
At this point, Robert turned to his wife in the other room.
Have we got a memory, Dale?
Yeah, he's got a memory like an elephant.
For several hours after Darcy's transfer to the hospital, official records suggest that prison authorities still thought he'd simply suffered a seizure. This was despite the prison's own rumour mill going into overdrive, as the prison guard James, one of the first to arrive on the scene of Darcy's attack, told me.
Can you recall what your immediate impression of what possibly had happened was?
Yes, he'd been struck around the head very hard with some firm or solid object.
James told me he was never interviewed by police. He still doesn't know why.
And can you recall asking around as to what may have happened?
I was just told that he'd been hit in the head with the paddle that was used to stir soups, stews, macaroni, etc. in one of the kettles. It was conveyed to me that the paddle had gone back into the kettle and was being used to stir that day's lunch. It had been immediately stuck back in there, but nobody was admitting who did it or why.
Of course, this differs from Robert Ogier's account that he saw the paddle line broken near Darcy. That won't be the last pair of conflicting accounts you'll hear about the paddle.
And can you recall who may have conveyed that information to you? Would that have been Jim?
Well, it could have been Jim, yeah. I can't recall exactly who it was.
Do you reckon it was in the immediate aftermath of the event or maybe later in the day?
Oh, I think it was fairly soon after the event, because it was conveyed to me that the paddle had gone back into the kettle and was being used to stir that day's lunch, if I remember correctly.
Did that stick in your memory because of the kind of, I suppose, for want of a better word, shocking aspect that a weapon that had been used to bash somebody was now back in the inmate's food?
No, not really. Prisons are a funny environment, and some funny things are amusing to some people and grotesque and horrific to others. I guess generally amongst everybody it seemed to be a bit humorous that it had been immediately stuck back in there, but nobody was admitting who did it or why.
Former Mount Eden guard Paul Lobb was also working that day, though he was in a different part of the prison.
We just heard that old Darcy had been smacked on the head, but didn't know anything else, really.
Mark Anthony, who we heard in the first episode, came on shift after the attack.
Wasn't it generally well understood amongst staff that morning that Darcy had been assaulted?
Yes. Yeah, it was an assault. It was never ever thought of as anything else. Not in any of my recollections was it ever perceived that it was an accident, fall down the stairs or a seizure or whatever. There was never ever part of it.
Now, in the prison nurse's report written on the day of the incident, she said at 7:55 a.m, Darcy was transferred to intensive care at Auckland Hospital, where it was reported that he was in a serious condition. But here's the thing. Even though prison guard James saw Darcy and thought he'd been bashed, and then other staff recalled hearing a short time later that's exactly what had occurred, it took 6 hours for anyone to call the police. That was according to the Mount Eden Superintendent Humphrey Stroud's report to the Secretary of Justice. His report is read by an actor.
At 1:30 p.m, the on-call officer, First Officer Dyer, was informed that the hospital authorities had been in touch, reporting that Te Hira had internal head injuries which were inconsistent with the previous seizure diagnosis. Mr. Dyer then called the police and asked them to investigate the matter.
This crucial delay in involving the police came at a big cost. Anyone with an interest in true crime stories will spot what a mistake this was. You'll know a crime scene needs to be secured as soon as possible to prevent evidence being lost. Well, at Mount Eden Prison that Sunday morning, neither the kitchen nor the lunchroom where Darcy was found were secured for hours.
I'm absolutely gobsmacked, quite honestly, Mike.
This is former guard Mark Anthony again.
So when did you first find out that the police weren't contacted until 1:30 in the afternoon?
I found out from you 20 minutes ago.
Oh. Okay.
The delay that's unbelievable, especially with, as you're well aware, with crime scenes or anything like that. That is just a totally unsatisfactory delay in time.
Even if it had been thought for a while, as at least is recorded the case, even if it was thought that Darcy had experienced a seizure, would it have been your expectation, knowing what you did about the protocols at that time, would you have expected the room to have been locked down?
If it was a seizure, no. Lots of things go on all the time, and you just quickly clean up and move on, sort of thing. But something involving, which then was quite blatantly a violent assault, that needed to be a crime scene. It's a crime scene. So then get everybody out of the place, or make it so that the scene is retained for evidence and work around it. But for hours to be involved is terrible.
So you wouldn't expect to call the cops for an illness. And Jim Steadman testified he didn't initially realise Darcy had a head injury and only learned foul play was suspected hours after Darcy was hospitalised. But for the staff who did suspect something untoward, well, former guards James and Mark both told me that back in 1985, protocol required senior management to be the ones to alert police to things like a prison assault. It wasn't something staff like them could do on their own. The first police officers to turn up at the prison were Detective Sergeant Neil Morris and Detective Constable David Turner. Morris, in particular, would play a key part in the investigation to come. Arriving at 4 p.m, Turner's job sheet describes how he carried out a search of the lunchroom. Here's what he wrote.
Area searched where Te Hira was located. No obvious signs of blood or anything suspicious. The area had, however, been cleaned, as he has apparently vomited everywhere during his fit.
Prison staff searched the recently cleaned kitchen and nearby bins for evidence such as a murder weapon, but found nothing. Then detectives got more bad news. They discovered that Steadman, the only independent, non-criminal witness in the kitchen, hadn't seen or heard what took place.
There was no yelling or arguing, although with the extractor fans going, it's pretty noisy in the kitchen.
Something Steadman also told fellow prison guard James.
Can you recall ever speaking to Jim after the event as to what he had seen or who he thought was responsible?
Yes, but he said he didn't see.
So he didn't see anything?
No. He told me he was in the office and his view was obstructed and he never saw anything. The office in the kitchen had just been shoved into a convenient corner, and the lunchroom was completely over the other side with just a relatively narrow doorway into it. You certainly couldn't see into the lunchroom from the office, even if the doorway wasn't obstructed.
Steadman later told police,
"Before, after and during this incident, I did not see any of the cook's paddles out of order."
It's yet another version of what happened to the paddle. James heard it was put back in the porridge. Robert, the ambulance officer, says it was broken on the floor. Now Steadman says nothing was out of order. The bit about Steadman not hearing anything from the lunchroom is less surprising. As former Mount Eden guard Paul Lobb pointed out to me,
Always noisy, there's always something. You've got 20-odd prisoners in and out and doing different things, walking in and out. You had all the... In those days, you had the steam pipes, everything cooking, and there was a lot of noise. Everything was very manual.
For the rest of that Sunday, detectives Turner and Morris conducted the first of many interviews with the inmates who'd been in the kitchen. At this stage, the police were still investigating an assault, not a murder, because at Auckland Hospital, Darcy Te Hira was still clinging to life. In the hospital's emergency ward at 8:50 on the Sunday morning, Senior Dr. Ronald Trubahovich examined Darcy. A warning, his descriptions of Darcy's injuries are confronting. If you prefer not to listen to this bit, skip forward 15 seconds or so.
He was deeply unconscious and bleeding from his nostrils and from his scalp. His surface injuries included grossly swollen and bruised eyelids and boggy swelling of the scalp all over his head, especially on the right side.
Reading the doctor's report of Darcy bleeding from the scalp brought me right back to those initial conflicting theories about what happened to Darcy, that he'd experienced a seizure or was the victim of a serious attack. To muddy those waters even more, I found a letter from the Secretary of Justice to the Justice Minister dated January the 7th, so the morning after Darcy's bashing. What's interesting is the letter refers to an initial belief that Darcy had fallen over and been discovered on the ground with a head wound. This contradicts Jim Steadman's account that he found Darcy convulsing in his chair, not on the ground, and Steadman and the nurses' accounts that they saw no visible injuries on Darcy. So why has the story changed? Was this proof of a cover-up, as Suzanne suspects? Or did staff genuinely miss the wound in the rush to save Darcy's life, and there had been simply a miscommunication as the incident was reported up the chain of command? Unfortunately, I can't ask the letter's author, the Secretary of Justice, because he's now dead. But it is hard to understand how we got from a seizure, or even a fall, to the injuries the doctor, Suzanne, and James described.
His head was swollen and his eyes were grotesquely protruding from his face.
Honestly, his eyes were out like tennis balls out of his head. He was just a mess. Massive big bruising.
Here's more from Dr. Trubahovich's notes.
We considered that he had a skull fracture, bruising of the brain underneath and high pressure inside his skull. This was affecting his breathing and obstructing his airway, so we applied remedial measures for that.
Darcy had a CT scan. The news wasn't good.
There was nothing remedial that could be done for the patient surgically, and with the expectation that his death would be probably inevitable. Later that same day, we had electrical testing conducted, and this demonstrated that brain activity had virtually stopped.
Around midday the following day, Monday the 7th of January, the difficult decision was made to switch off Darcy's life support.
The only thing that's keeping him alive is the respirator machine.
Darcy's wife, Suzanne Young, was at his side. But to her surprise, the doctors told her that at 20, she was too young to make the decision to turn off her husband's life support.
Yeah, they said, you can't do it. We need to get, that's when they said, your parents' consent.
I mean, you've been obviously a nurse. Did that make sense to you, that you weren't old enough at 19?
I'd never even thought about it. I'd never even thought it was a thing that you had to, like being his wife and obviously next to kin and everything, that, Because, I mean, I was there right through when they took him off the machine.
The police investigation into a prison assault was now officially a prison murder inquiry. As I've already signalled, police investigating Darcy's murder would find no forensic evidence, no fingerprints, blood, hair or fibres. Due to the delay in calling the police, the whole area had been cleaned. So, to eventually bring a charge of murder, police and prosecutors ultimately relied on witness testimony. And the only witnesses were a band of fraudsters, burglars and violent criminals. But there was a small amount of scientific evidence in the form of the injuries Darcy sustained. We'll start with Darcy's post-mortem conducted by Auckland forensic pathologist Dr. Warwick Smeaton. His words are voiced.
At approximately 4:30 p.m. on the 7th of January 1985, I performed a post-mortem examination on the body of Darcy Te Hira in the presence of Detective Senior Sergeant Hill, Detective Murphy and Detective Lowry.
Dr. Smeaton noted small bruises and abrasions on the right of Darcy's abdomen, the base of his right thumb, the upper parts of both arms, and a larger bruise on Darcy's right shoulder. But the most significant injuries were to Darcy's brain and skull.
There was a fracture in the skull on the right side which ran downwards and forwards from the front to the back. In addition, transmitted forces had resulted in fracturing of the roof of the eye sockets on both sides, and this fracturing had led to bruising around both eyes. With the extent of bruising as well as the fractures, the force of the impact would have been substantial. The appearances suggest the injuries would be caused by a flat instrument. The extent of bruising and small fractures would suggest more than one blow, but it is possible that they may have been caused by one.
Dr. Smeaton was later asked if one of the large wooden kitchen paddles could have inflicted the injuries found on Darcy.
This instrument could have caused those injuries.
Given Darcy's fractures were located on the right-hand side of his skull, Dr. Smeaton believed it was most likely that the blows were struck from Darcy's right side. But he said the offender could have changed positions between strikes.
In my opinion, the cause of death was due to head injuries. There was no contributory natural disease.
It's been 4 decades since Dr. Smeaton provided his views on Darcy Te Hira's injuries and cause of death. It's a long time in the field of forensic medicine, so I decided to seek the opinion of another pathologist.
I was a surgeon till 1976. I then turned to pathology. And with the crash of the DC-10 on Mount Erebus, I ended up as a forensic pathologist and I retired as a forensic pathologist, a professor at the Auckland Medical School.
This is retired forensic pathologist Dr. Timothy Kohlmeyer. He's been in the business for quite a while.
Probably a total of about 30-odd years, I suppose.
Do you have in your mind an estimate or a number of how many homicides you worked on?
That's a difficult one because I've been involved both for prosecution and the defense, a total of around about 100-odd, maybe 150.
I asked Dr. Kohlmeyer to review Dr. Smeaton's post-mortem notes and the evidence he gave about Darcy's death. He agreed with Dr. Smeaton's conclusions.
The cause of death has been fracture to the skull with associated laceration to the brain substance caused by a blow or blows to these structures by a flattish instrument.
He also believed Darcy's skull fractures indicated the weapon had a broad, flat striking surface like the wooden kitchen paddle.
You supplied me the photograph of it, and the best description is that it looked like a cricket bat with a long handle on steroids. Big heavy thing.
You'll remember Suzanne, Darcy's wife, couldn't understand why it took hours for prison staff to realise Darcy had been assaulted and hadn't simply experienced a seizure.
Why would they say that to me?
Yeah.
When they knew damn well what had happened.
I asked Dr. Kohlmeyer what he thought, whether he'd expect Darcy's injuries would have been immediately obvious.
Yes, Yes, not necessarily just the trained eye. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me either. Looking back all these years later, which way are we meant to lean? I mean, was it just a misdiagnosis? I can't ask many of the prison staff present that day more about what injuries they did or didn't see on Darcy, or to respond to Suzanne's concerns. Jim Steadman and the prison medical officer have since passed away, and the prison nurse was too frail to answer any questions. And to be fair, both diagnoses, fitting or fatal head injury, could have been correct, because blunt force trauma can lead to immediate seizures. But what about the delay in contacting police? Was it intentional, or was it the result of an honest but mistaken belief that Darcy experienced a seizure? Remember, many staff didn't report seeing any blood or obvious injuries on Darcy. And prison officers were really quick to call the ambulance. But the long delay in police being contacted and the conflicting descriptions of Darcy's injuries are certainly puzzling. To try and get more answers, we contacted the corrections department that runs the prison system in New Zealand. We sent them a lot of questions about Darcy's death, including Suzanne's concerns. Their response is voiced by an actor.
Firstly, we wish to note that the death of a loved one while in prison is difficult, and our condolences go to the family and friends of Darcy Te Hira. Due to the passage of time and the loss of institutional knowledge and staff, and our reliance on the archived records that are still held, we are limited in our capacity to address queries resulting from this event that occurred 40 years ago. Corrections is unable to provide comment and respond to Ms Young's concerns and assertions.
Corrections also told us they couldn't say if the prison's response to Darcy's death was acceptable, because they don't have a copy of the staff manual in force at the time, and the Justice Department that ran Mount Eden in 1985 no longer exists. Not deterred, I decided to go to what my wife sometimes tells me is my second home.
Okay, so I'm standing outside the National Library in Wellington because I have discovered that the library has a copy of the old prison staff manual. Oh, g'day. I had ordered, under the name of Mike Wesley Smith, it's called the Penal Division Manual. Yeah, thanks.
I had a good look through the manual and a few interesting things stood out to me. Firstly, the manual tells staff that if an inmate has an accident while using machinery, the Department of Labour had to be notified. But rather oddly, there is no written guidance that police should be called if someone is assaulted or murdered. Instead, staff are advised to alert the Secretary of Justice, which is precisely what happened in Darcy's case. Fortunately, I did manage to track down Errol Dyer. He was a senior Mount Eden prison officer in 1985. He wasn't on site when Darcy was attacked, but assisted detectives when they started their investigation. Dyer didn't want to do an audio interview, but was happy to respond to questions by email. I asked him for his response to the concerns raised by Suzanne concerning the initial handling of Darcy's assault. Dyer told me the on-duty senior officers were reliable and honest, not people who would have covered anything up. Regarding the concern that the scene was cleaned, Mr. Dyer said that given the initial belief that Darcy had experienced a seizure, he would have expected the kitchen area to be thoroughly cleaned before the next meal was served. And as for the visibility of Darcy's injuries, Mr. Dyer says guards relied on the prison clinician's seizure diagnosis, one he says wasn't disputed by the ambulance crew that arrived a short time later. He also says that once Mount Eden staff learned from Auckland Hospital that Darcy had been assaulted, the police were notified. I thought Dyer made some fair points, but still, the whole thing continued to play on my mind. For another perspective, I spoke to a former senior prison manager who started their career in the 1980s. This person, who wishes to remain anonymous, says the handling of Darcy's incident could have been better. They say that given the inconsistencies in some of the original reports about the incident, it feels to them as though there might have been an initial attempt to keep what happened quiet. Finally, they said prison management should have kept Suzanne better informed. After all this, I'm not convinced there was some concerted effort to cover up anything about how Darcy died. If there is evidence, I haven't found it. But yeah, there are certainly unanswered questions. And for Darcy's widow, Suzanne, it's all still unsettling. 40 years later, she's still discovering new information about what happened the day her husband was murdered inside a secure prison.
To be honest, I was absolutely shocked after you told me.
The authorities never told her how long it took police to be contacted or that the crime scene was cleaned before detectives arrived.
And I think now that, with more coming out, it's, as I said, it's affected me probably more now than it ever has. Why? Why wasn't I told right from the start?
Sorry.
That's fine. But that's fine.
Is what I told you, just confirmed your original instincts?
Yeah.
Her instincts that she wasn't given the full picture from the get-go.
Do you think either trial heard the full story of what happened to your husband?
No.
And how does that make you feel?
Angry. Sickened to feel that in such, I suppose, circumstances where he was supposedly under the protection of the Crown, it should never have happened. Answers would be good.
Yeah. Even all these years later?
Yeah, I think so. Just to give me peace of mind.
Yeah.
Back in 1985, as the police murder investigation moved into gear, the question of who killed Darcy Te Hira hung in the stale air within Mount Eden prison.
You never fucking learn, do you? Do you think I'd tell you if I did know?
And according to our former prison guard James, in a matter of hours, one of the names being put forward as a potential suspect was Ross Appelgren.
I don't know anything and I didn't see anything. And I don't want to know anything or see anything.
So as the cops left Mount Eden that Sunday evening, they were still without a suspect. But late that night, an inmate, alone on his bed, was writing a curious note. It was addressed to First Prison Officer Errol Dyer, who had earlier in the day alerted police to Darcy's bashing. To disguise his identity, the note's author scrawled in his left hand and took extra care to leave no fingerprints on the paper. The mysterious message simply said, "Mr. Dyer, look for third paddle in accident kitchen." Next time on Nark. Thanks for listening to Nark, hosted and written by me, Mike Wesley-Smith. I'm also extremely grateful to everyone who spoke with me for this podcast, especially Suzanne Young and Julia Appelgren. And if anyone listening has more information about this case, I'd be keen to hear from you. Send an email to nark@rnz.co.nz. Follow and listen to Nark wherever you get your podcasts, and if you've enjoyed it, use the share button to recommend it to a friend. Some more quick thank yous to Ngā Taonga and Mediaworks for some of the archival audio, and to the voice actors who helped bring some of the characters in this episode to life. Blair Stagpool, Craig Genty, Nick Robinson, Brianna Uritich-Gregg, William Ray, Glenn Scanlon, Luke Bodle, Taylor Sincock, Liz Garton and Jack Sargent. The RNZ producers who worked on this episode were Liz Garton, William Ray, Duncan Smith and Phil Vine. The audio engineers were Mark Chesterman and William Saunders. Thanks also to Steve Burridge and Jeremy Ansell for the studio wrangling, and to Kevin Golding for opening the doors to me every week after hours. Graphics were designed by Amrita Marks, and the shorthand page, where you can find more information on this story, was made by Hing Yi Kong. Check it out at rnz.co.nz/nark. Tim Watkin is RNZ's Executive Editor Audio, and Brianna Uritich-Gregg is the Production Coordinator. You can find more of RNZ's great podcasts like Search and Rescue on the RNZ website, rnz.co.nz/podcasts. Check them out. Bye for now.